Habari gani, karibuni, asanteni sana. Thank you all for being with us today. Welcome. We once again are blessed to have another member of the community join us, our brother. I will let him introduce himself. It's good to have him with us today. But before he does that, again, my name is Nduku Mulumba, one of the two co-hosts on Kumbukeni, joining my brother Allimadi to counter the false narrative that the West has propagated against Africa and Africans for too long, and also to bring the African story from an African perspective, finally defining ourselves, kujichagulia. It's good to be here with everyone today. Allimadi.
Yes, sisters and brothers, friends, comrades from wherever you're joining us today, welcome to our weekly Chuo Kikuu. Chuo Kikuu, as you should know by now, of course, is the Kiswahili word for university. So this is our weekly global digital university. And today we will discuss aspects of Pan-Africanism with our guest. And I like what the chapter that he wrote, part of a book. I read the chapter, Future of Pan-Africanism. I like one of the first things that the chapter says, the time has come for Pan-Africanism to evolve from ideas into practical use and development. Karibu Ndugu.
Karibu, Ndugu Baruti. I want to call you Mzee Katembo because you are my elder instead of Ndugu, since we are not peers. No, that's a no, Baruti. All right. So please introduce yourself. Let the people know who you are.
So first of all, habari yako Bantu, and thank you very much for having me on the program today. My name is Baruti Katembo, and as Milton was alluding to, there's a chapter in a book called The Future of Pan-Africanism. That is a chapter that comes from a work that I was a co-author on. The book is called UWENZI, The Pan-African Factor, a 21st Century View. And it was co-written by myself, David Akombo, and Kemet Shockley back in 2016. So UWENZI is a Kiswahili name for cooperation. And I think that that is a major factor underneath Pan-Africanism. Also, let me say in the introduction of myself, I'm also a board member with the Lutombi Kawana Integrity Foundation. We call it LKif for short, as an acronym, and that is a Zambian think tank and socioeconomic development organization that's based in Zambia. So thank you again for having me, and I look forward to very enlightening discussion with you all.
Okay, good. And I asked the audience if do you both hear the crackling sound in the audio?
A little bit.
Is it just me?
Yeah, a little bit. I wonder, is that coming from your mic?
Yeah, I think, Ndugu Baruti's.
You think it's coming from me?
Yes, it is.
Are you using an external mic or using the computer mic?
I'm using the computer mic.
Okay. I mean, it's there. It's not that disruptive. I can hear you, but yeah. It's there.
It keeps going away too. There's something like now it's all right. We can continue. It's not as disruptive. Yeah, let's continue. All right. So today we're going to look at again the concept of Bantu in a Pan-African sense, and how we identify ourselves as a collective people, and also talk about it specifically in the sense of how we interact with each other, how we cooperate economically and politically. So, Ndugu Baruti, if you can please, first of all, talk to us about how you all three, as you wrote the book UWENZI, came about this idea that we should all identify ourselves as Bantu people. Why, and why Bantu?
Okay, so if we recall that at one point, the ideas for collectively identifying people by race was done by Mzungu people in a collective way. They would write Mongoloid, Caucasoid, and Negroid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, so those were terms that they used from their understandings of their languages to define other races of people. So no matter whether those terms are good or bad, I think that all races of people need to define themselves from their own language bases collectively. So let's start with in this particular case, Negro. So as you will see in that chapter, there are various words from European languages that are spin-offs from the word from Negro. In fact, I'm looking directly, at some of the writings from that chapter,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll see. And I'll just kind of read for a second that that the word Negro is sourced from the Latin word nigger, Niger. Now I said nigger, but sometimes people will say Niger, but saying Niger from a French base, but during the Roman Empire, in terms of the starting of Latin, there was no French.
Mm-hmm.
French language is a spinoff of the Romance languages, or those of Rome, Latin. So, and I pointed out that the word nigra is feminine, nigger is masculine, nigrum is neuter. These root words have spawned numerous noun variations denoting an African. Okay, and so different words: Spanish, Negro, uh, Spanish Portuguese, Negro, French, Negre, and in various Germanic languages, in Dutch, Negar, and in German, Neger, or U.S. English, nigger. So that means that if any people define another people from their own languages in terms of how they are classified racially, they have the upper hand in regard to how those words are connotated, not just based on the race, but various attributes. So we know that, in fact, the word Negro or nigger has negative connotations. Those who are stupid, dumb, lazy. And then we connect it to African people.
Mm-hmm.
So from that, I think that we as a people need to be able to define ourselves by some linguistic base for ourselves. So when I look at the term Bantu, we know that Bantu is a general term that just means people or humans, denoting what we call ourselves, and from that, the idea of humanity or our work or our worldview about what it means to be human. We attach our own attributes to that. So we know that human beings started in Africa. Most scientists would say somewhere between the west side of Tanzania, west bottom side of Uganda, and the right side of the Congo. Though some other more recent ideas would be somewhere in the Zambezi, Botswana area. But somehow or another, those areas that are offshoots of Congo. So if we want to go back to the earliest languages, click languages, in terms of not being words as we know them now, then we have to go back to the Khoisan languages. But the first languages are going to be those languages that are offshoots of Congo, which we would denote as Bantu. So from my research on this, then it would seem as though Bantu would be, a very apropos name overall for us, and we can get beyond this idea that we're going to limit Bantu to be 1,000 languages on the continent, only having words that have NTU as a name for a person or some variation of that, or all the languages that just have, say, the word kumi for 10. Then we limit ourselves, when really these are the basic source structures that represent the collective ethos, personality, and linguistic distribution in relative form across the continent. And therefore extensions of African people in the diaspora, who are people who are forcibly migrated from these basic areas. Let me also to the Western Hemisphere and to places in what is now called Middle East. Let me just also say that the word Bantu, in terms of why choose a word from a linguistic base, that also tends to represent language, geography, something about culture that can be referenced. There's nothing wrong with the term African, that's fine. But if we want to go into deeper layers, I think we need something that represents a linguistic base. And by the way, everybody, just having seen some of your shows earlier, when you had Dr. Lagoke on, and you talked about the word Ubuntu, we know that really, if you take off the U in Ubuntu, you get Buntu, which is really a derivation of Bantu. And then we put the U on the front, which really means a worldview. You can look at that in various Bantu languages, specifically in Kiswahili. It means the worldview of Bantu. Worldview of the Bantu would be our ideas about humanity. I am because we are, as people would phrase, of what Ubuntu translates in the general sphere of things.
As you continue to talk about Bantu, and as we at Mbongi ya Ubuntu, which was formerly known as Jumuiya ya Nguzo Saba, continue to look at our African languages, I am thinking now, I break down Bantu, right? It goes back to Ntu, which is Utu, which is our humanness, right? Which goes back to that concept again of Ubuntu. But that Ntu is seen all over Africa. And that Ba is of. So the people of Utu is essentially what Bantu means. So I agree with you in that sense that this is an African term that we should take on. And for this has come up before, and Allimadi also, you can talk about this. Because the white man decides to choose a certain group of people to put under first of all, Bantu is not their name, despite the fact that they take it and abuse it and end up using it to subjugate Africans in the southern part of Africa. It's not their term. It's an African term that they encountered and they decided to take and manipulate. So we can literally say this is a word we are taking back because it's ours, and we can ground it in our Africanness.
Excellent point. If I may duck in, before Milton says anything. I'm not sure if he wanted to interject.
Go ahead, please, brother.
But let me say this. So you made the point that in many cases, in some ways, people in the Republic of South Africa have rejected the term Bantu because of its misuse by Wazungu people, or Afrikaner, the Boer, the Englishman there, to make the term Bantu bad or negative or seem primitive or less than human. But in fact, the word Bantu is from our languages. So as you correctly pointed out, we're just simply taking back a word that should have never been made to be made low, we should have already had the narrative on the word that could not be tarnished or tainted by others. So the taking back of the word is powerful. I also want to reference that sometimes I've come into conversation with people, or at least seen sometimes on various social media, that when sometimes the term Bantu is brought up, this will be commentary from people who might live in the diaspora, and also people who might be living in so-called West African countries who have been told that they're not Bantu or should not be thought of as such. They say, oh, anyway, what wasn't Bantu just made up by some white person? And who they're referring to is Dr. Wilhelm Bleek, who is a German linguist of the 19th century. And I often think about that, and I have commented sometimes that Wilhelm Bleek simply just denoted the fact of his studying various languages on the continent, that most of them had words that either were the word Bantu for people or humans, or some variation of that. He just merely pointed out that these languages had a common core and that they use this word for people. So again, we're taking back what belongs to us and creating the narrative around us.
Allimadi.
All right, very good. So once again, thank you, brother, for joining us today on a topic that is very dear to our heart, of course, the whole concept of practical Pan-Africanism. So I read your chapter and I like it. I think we need to focus on a few issues on that chapter. So, for example, when we say the concept of Ubuntu, I think all African people that are into Pan-Africanism understand what that means. The humanity and inclusive of all African peoples. But the way things are set up now intellectually, historically in African countries, if we say we should promote the word as the identifiable, as the way to identify people in the diaspora as Bantu, then an African on the continent, in Somalia, for example, in Ethiopia, or even Luo-speaking people in East and Central Africa, would say this would seem not embracive and inclusive enough, and would seem to exclude us from that concept. You see what I'm saying? So maybe you should also spend some time talking a little bit about that. How would you reconcile that? Because obviously we all want to use that concept of Ubuntu, I am because you are, which resonates not only on the continent, but by the way, but globally. So for example, you also discussed Kiswahili, and you say Kiswahili, there's no issue of ethnocentrism. And since you wrote that chapter, Kiswahili has actually become even much more embraced and pervasive throughout the continent now, being elevated even by the African Union, as you pointed out. So if you could talk about those two aspects, and then we can get later on into the economic cooperation that you also discussed. Thank you.
Okay, so I hope I hit exactly what you meant, but I'll try to hit some points of it, and then you kind of fill in or prod me if I need to kind of dangle around some other areas. All right, so let me say this. So if we start with the diaspora, if we talk about Bantu, or if we talk about Ubuntu, let's deal with each term. So Ubuntu, of course, we know that the term is from the Nguni language group, subgroup, or smaller group of what people would consider Bantu, that lists different languages in Southern Africa, which would be Zulu and Kiswati, etc. But we accept the term's prominence so that all African people can embrace the concept, whether they had that particular word or variation of that word in particular languages. But we're trying to be bigger than our immediate geography. All right, so Nduku, that kind of goes back in some ways. I remember you had an exchange with a gentleman that was one of the panelists on the Kumbukeni. I think the gentleman was a person from Nigeria that was a journalist. And he pointed out to you that, he said, I can tell you, he said, Yoruba people do not celebrate Ubuntu. They don't practice Ubuntu at all. And you were mentioning to him that, oh, I'm sure you do. It might not be that particular word. But what you were trying to get over to him was that it's not just the word, it's the ideas and concepts. But in the Pan-African sense, if we have a term that that embraces what we're doing, then in terms of a Pan-African sense, let's go with something that's common, even if from another area in terms of geography than where we're from, to embrace the bigness of ourselves, because we can all take components of who we are in the different spaces and integrate it in. This also comes into some discussion that was made at one point about why not take words from different African languages and absorb them into Kiswahili, either just directly into the in class. We want to get into Kiswahili of words that are loan words. We don't have to change the structure of word at all, or putting a prefix in some of the other classes we want to get into, whether it's the Kiwi now class or Mwa. I know I'm going into the structure of things, but nevertheless, that's the case, because if we see Kiswahili as a language, we know that Kiswahili is an amalgamation of at least 10 different so-called Bantu languages that made up its basic lexicon. Maybe in the show we can get into this name Kiswahili. Should it remain because of the Sahel piece being an Arabic word for coast? We can get into that. You made the reference, I think, one time about using Ubuntu as a new name for Kiswahili that would allow us to embrace all of it. Okay, so on that end, Ubuntu can be embraced by all. Now, when it comes to Bantu, you might say, well, why do some of us feel excluded, perhaps, from the term Bantu? Okay, now, for people in the diaspora, they should not feel excluded from the term Bantu, because even in the United States, for example, we can look at the fact of the tapestry of the United States is loaded with Africa itself. All kinds of words that are in the United States lexicon and cultural constructs come from Africa, in particular words that survive in English here, like gumbo, marimba, for xylophone, all kinds of things. There's a candy that's sold in the U.S. called Goober's Peanuts, but the word goober, Goober, is actually from a Congo word, nguba, which means a brown nut. But it's been re-altered in terms of some of the parts of the pronunciation. And I bring this up because just for the program today, I wanted to flash a name of a book here called The Bantu Speaking Heritage of the United States. It's a book written in 1979 by an anthropologist by the name of Winifred Vass. And it breaks down how the linguistic tapestry from Africa in the United States comes directly from the category of Bantu languages. There is another book entitled Congo Across the Water. Congo spelled with a K, not a C. Here they're talking about Congo as in the 3 or 4 countries that made up the Congo Kingdom: Angola, DRC, the small Congo. Those 3, sometimes people may put what's now Cameroon in there, but at least the first 3. And Congo Across the Water, when people see the title, they think that they might be talking about, oh, if you're in another part of the world, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, that you're looking over to the Congo as in like Central Africa. But really what the book is talking about is the essence of the Congo in the United States and other places in the so-called Western Hemisphere. That's what I want to hit on first. One more point, Milton, to your question is for the show, I wrote a note to myself that I wanted to convey, not knowing, Milton, that somehow your question to me might prompt me to say this. But I wanted to just say this on air. There is a Bantu Research Center at the University of Ghent. And this is a university in Belgium. In fact, they have a website. It's called, Bantu Ghent. BANTU-GENT. Even though the university is Ghent, GHENT, but their research center is with Bantu Ghent, GENT. But I want to point out that this is a research center, believe it or not, that has at least 25 scholars. You can just look on their website. Most of them are Mzungu people who study all things Bantu to help them to understand all things African. And within their scholar base, they have at least 2 to 3 people that are Ethiopian, that are part of the Bantu Research Center. So, therefore, people in Ethiopia, as you referenced, Milton, as we move into a Pan-African idea, should not in any way feel excluded from the term Bantu, because we're talking about just African people overall. So what does it also mean for the EAC, East African Community, for it now to absorb South Sudan? People are now thinking about, well, maybe eventually Somalia. So if it's part of the EAC and Kiswahili is being used or being promoted as a lingua franca overall, and Kiswahili would be classified as a Bantu language, then would it not be a fact that if we as a people are embracing Kiswahili and all that it would mean and concepts around it, the NTU as idea for personal, NTU stemming from these Bantu origins of people, that in fact, by extension, those countries and people that will be part of the EAC could now see themselves as being Bantu people or Bantoid people, simply because of the embrace of the language.
They won't. So let me add a follow up to your
tell me why they won't or why they can't. I know that you're not saying that you don't think they should, but tell me why.
No, of course not. I'm saying they won't because for a long time they've been reared to. First of all, the whole concept of the word tribe. When I talk to my African people, I understand what they mean. They want to distinguish that, if in Uganda I come from Buganda, I come from Acholi, I come from Karamoja, so that's fine when my African sisters and brothers use that. But when Europeans use it, it's a different concept and connotation altogether. They never use it in a positive sense. It's always a pejorative term. So you have there are in Somalia and Ethiopia, there are Bantu Somalis and Bantu Ethiopians, and they don't make up the majority in those countries.
Right.
The majority are seen as either Cushitic people or Afro-Asiatic people. And that's just, the way things have evolved for decades now, over a century since the engagement with colonialism. So now, if we start promoting the concept that, and in fact, what you're saying is absolutely true, because most sisters and brothers who are forcefully taken were taken from the west coast of Africa, at least the Atlantic side and not the Indian Ocean side. So it makes total sense to promote or embrace the concept that we are a Bantu people. So that I have no argument against. But for the broader goal of bringing diaspora, all Africans in diaspora with continental Africans, it would seem to me that it would interject an unintended wedge. Because then,
between who?
In the broader picture,
Okay.
between those that say, "Oh no, I accept the concept of Ubuntu because we have it in our communities, even though we are not seen as a Bantu people. Let's say we are seen as a Luo, Nilotic people, Nilo-Saharan people. We have that." So I think the Nigerian who said they didn't have Ubuntu was incorrect. They may not have the word Ubuntu,
right,
but the concept of Ubuntu is within all African people. Because after all, as you pointed in the beginning, we all originated from a very narrow, small location, thought to be East and Central Africa, right? So I'm saying, another part of your chapter, you say, let's focus on themes that can easily bring us all together. And one of the themes that can easily bring us all together is Kiswahili. Whether a person that speaks Kiswahili is not seen as a quote-unquote Bantu person, the Kiswahili is so pervasive and so widespread and spoken practically that it doesn't really matter. You can say, okay, why are you speaking Kiswahili and you're not a Bantu person? What does it matter? I'm speaking Kiswahili, right? But when you start saying, okay, so I'm saying diaspora, let's call ourselves Bantu people. And then I say, well, I happen to be Nilo-Saharan. Are you saying I'm not connected to that diaspora African? So I'm just saying in the broader picture, it would seem to me that and you're not wrong, because as I just laid out, historically, practically, and the way things evolve, in fact, yes, I would say a majority of diaspora here in the United States are Bantu people.
right.
But strategically, in the whole concept of building that bigger Pan-African world, does that aid us, or might that create an intended rift? That's the only thing I'm saying. But practically, I'm not contradicting what you laid out.
Well, I think Bantu conceptually, is a word that certainly the diaspora can use for itself, and that would be true origins. I really meant that to be, more of a link pin for the diaspora in terms of the larger connectedness to the continent going before colonial borders.
Oh yeah, definitely. But I agree with that. Nobody can argue with that. That's a fact, in fact. You see.
But in the larger scheme of things, it's okay if we have to bring along other people.
There you go.
In the eastern horn of Africa, who don't see themselves that way, perhaps Kiswahili,
Right.
Eventually will turn on a light bulb, or maybe that won't really be necessary. Just Kiswahili will help to
Exactly, because
do
otherwise they're
that.
going to, if you speak in a setting one day in some university in East Africa, and somebody's going to ambush you with that same question, and it might take the rest of the discussion by just, be on that alone. So maybe you should see that as something to anticipate as well. But
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
but
oh yeah, sure,
yeah,
sure. But really, that was really for the diaspora.
right. I understood it
Right.
100%. I understood it 100%. But I just wanted to present something that you may encounter along the way. So we can move on.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I have been,
It's amazing when it comes to
Brother
just
Baruti, quickly before you explain. I've been talking and wondering why my brothers cannot hear me. I didn't realize I was on mute. Here's the thing, though. As you both, the question Allimadi you asked, the explanation you gave, Baruti. As we continue to do the work on the Kiswahili, I've been saying lately, the evidence is in the African languages. The evidence on any argument that we talk about whether we are similar or not similar is in the African languages. We have our brother, Professor Kwesi Kwapra, right? He leads the Center for Advanced Studies of African Society, CASAS. And he's done the research where he's looked at all African languages and has brought them down, narrowed them down to two main groups. And what I'm saying is, if you believe in Ubuntu, you should believe in Bantu. You should believe in Kibantu. That is literally the same thing linguistically. And if you are a Nilot, you are basically a Nilot because white people said, you people who live along the Nile,
now.
Nilots.
Right.
If you are a Kushite, white people came and saw you as a Kush, which has the K, and changed it to the C and said, you people who are associated with this are Kushites. So those two terms are very much the white man, through his linguistic ways, determining who you are. The Bantu was termed that way because there were many African Bantu groups that had this Ubuntu concept. And this white man saw that and he said, okay, these people then will be, and understood our language and knew we had the Ba, right? Bakongo, Baluya, all that. And he took our language and put a term that was very much African. So we as Africans need to understand that Bantu is not just limited to the so-called Bantu speaking people, but it's essentially our way, the way of Utu, the
Exactly.
Ubuntu way. So if you're embracing Ubuntu, you should embrace Bantu because it literally is the same thing. Because Ba means of, Untu, the humanness. So the people of humanness. Ubuntu is the practice of humanness.
Exactly.
Kibantu is the language of those people, which is what we should call Kiswahili. So, I mean, we need to start, if nothing else, when we are arguing these things, we need to starting from a point of view. We need something that brings us together. All of us agreeing that we need something that brings us together. What is the thing that is closest to bringing us together? And this is it.
Absolutely. It's amazing how various African terms, in this particular case, Swahili, has been infused into even English. And I'll just give an example. One of the newest words, and not that we need their acknowledgement, but this is just for note, that's been officially listed now as an English word according to the Oxford Dictionary is Inyamachoma, real meat. Since 2021, that word, along with 200 other what was considered other East African terms, have now been part of English. So what does this really mean? Take African terms and then all of a sudden it becomes part of English. That means that other people realize the usage of things in our languages and they incorporate it into their structures as a resource for themselves. Okay, so in this sense, and in the reverse sense, Nduku, particularly to a point that I referenced from you earlier, that we can do the same thing, of course, with Kiswahili, to take words from other languages, which that's how Kiswahili really started, as an amalgamation of different kind of Bantu languages, and we can incorporate words into Kiswahili, making Kiswahili even more inclusive geographically in areas where it's not currently spoken or necessarily embraced.
Yeah.
And Nduku, if I can, and of course, Milton, I certainly want you to comment on this, but this particular question was directed at something that I had. I think I had emailed a comment during a live session when we were having the show before, but I think Nduku, when you mentioned something about, you thought Kiswahili should be, Kibuntu.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I had done is I had written a comment, and it's also in the chapter. I said something to the effect of, I thought that maybe Kiswahili, instead of it being listed as that, in terms of an extension of Arab peoples coming to East Africa, and then just kind of looking at the language structures that they found on the coast and said, okay, they're speaking something, we'll call it Sahil for coast in Arabic, that we need to basically give credit to actually the founders. And so I said Kimi-Jikenda as language of the Mijikenda people. And then I wanted to just go into that for a second, just get your reaction to, you're saying Ubuntu. Okay, so if we break down Mijikenda, we know that Miji means towns or villages. Kenda is an older word other than Tisa.
It's not even older. It's a Bantu word for 9.
Right.
It's the same word in my language. Yes.
Right. But so the 9 towns or 9 villages really represent 9 different dialects of people that stretch from what is now the upper end of Somalia down to Mozambique. So we take the collective 9 dialects or so that form the basic lexicon of what we now know as Kiswahili. So I was saying, okay, well, let's give credit to those people and take it out of the context of any Arabic context and put it back into, an African context, because of some loan words in Kiswahili, only 8%, by the way, that are coming from any other languages other than African languages. People try to expand that and say, oh, Kiswahili is just Pidgin Bantu with Arab language, and it's not really an African language, and people do all kind of denigrations to it. And so to take it out of that context completely, I said Kimi-Jikenda. But I have no problem with your assertion about the name Kibuntu. And before you respond, I wanted to point out an article that I read. It was called Bantu's Swahili, How to Steal a Language from Africa.
I have seen that, yeah.
And it was written by a person whose name is Kamau Mujiga, I think. And he's a professor at the Jomo Kenyatta University. But anyway, he wrote about Kiswahili being strictly a Bantu language, and how, the exaggeration that people want to say about, Arab influence to denigrate its Bantu-ness, I think is of note. So please, I'm sorry to be so long-winded on your
No,
point.
do not be sorry. I've also
But
said that
please.
we people of Ubuntu have been conditioned to apologize too much for things we don't need to apologize to, and I think it comes from
Right.
the enslavement and the punishment of us, right? You did nothing wrong, brother. You don't need to apologize. I understand the reason to want to go back to calling it Kimijikenda. But Kiswahili is not just formed by the Mijikenda. Kiswahili, there were Akamba people who traveled to the coast. There were Agikuyu people who traveled to the coast, right? It
Okay.
is seen in, you literally will say some things in Kiswahili and they're similar to Luganda, right?
Right.
They're
Okay.
similar to people who are internal beyond the Mijikendas, which is why we're saying what is the one thing that is common in all of us? It's that Untu. That one is literally across Africa. No
Okay.
matter where you go, you will find it. And
Okay.
therefore, instead of focusing on that area, it's better to focus on where we can identify ourselves as a collective, and it is
Okay.
showing up everywhere. As
All
far
right.
as bringing the other languages into Kibuntu, now I'm going to make an intentional choice to start calling Kiswahili Kibuntu. Um,
Okay.
in terms of that, we will be doing that. The Mbongi ya Ubuntu will be doing that. It's not a matter of can we, should we will be doing that. We will be taking words from other African languages that are not represented currently in Kibuntu and bringing them in and taking out the Arabic. So we will be
Okay.
doing that. Yes.
So let me get this straight. And again, I appreciate that. So therefore, when you heard me say Kimi Jakenda, you're saying that you feel like yes, the 9 areas of the Kimi and Jakenda people, yes, contributed, but there is a wider core that can be used for inclusion based upon the notion of Ubuntu as name for a person. As you mentioned, Kamba, people traveling to the east, etc. And
Mhm.
also, I guess we can go even further into the hinterland in
Mhm.
that sense. You
Yes.
feel like a name like Kibuntu connects the wider picture, not excluding
Mhm.
the Mijakenda grouping, but including more groups that contributed to the overall lexicon of the language. Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Okay. So what do you think, if I may say, Kumbukeni is going to embark on to promote Kibuntu? Because I
So
think that's powerful.
yes, I am a member, together with other people of Ubuntu. I am a member of Mbongi ya Ubuntu, formerly known as Jumuiya ya Nguzo Saba, and we are doing the active work. I am in volunteering to speak in places. I am available to speak in places. I just attended the African Languages Conference and the celebration of African languages at the end of that celebration, and I was talking about this, and I was very happy to see fellow people of Ubuntu talking about this and embracing it from the western side, from the southern side, and from everywhere. So this is what we're going to be doing in that community. We're going to be publishing, we're going to be translating books, revolutionary books that have been written in English into this language that is African. We're going to have events where we teach the youth about it. We are going to have political education where we educate our people. So I am a member of Kumbukeni, and through the other work I'm doing, which is not separate because we are one people, right? Which is
Right.
not separate. Through the active organization that we have registered, Mbongi ya Ubuntu will be doing the work to extend the language and to ground us and reclaim our way of Ubuntu.
You mentioned the term Mbongi, and immediately when you mentioned the term Mbongi, um, 2 things come to mind. One is a person by the name of Dr. Fukiao Bunseku. You probably, okay, the Congolese linguistic scholar who wrote a book called Mbongi, an African Traditional Political Institution. And it's a small book. In fact, I actually, let's see, I actually brought that with me. It's a very good book, actually.
Yep.
And The reason why I like that is because it really talks about how in ancient times we built consensus amongst people who lived in different communities geographically, but we found, common ground and a resolution to problems. So I wanted to point that out. Also, that the word Mbangi, as you probably know, as both of you probably know, had been taken from that context about just building consensus to now being thought of as a word that means a think tank.
Yep.
And there was a person by the name of Dr. Asa Hilliard, who's no longer with us, who, would embrace the term Mbangi in a practical sense of calling together forums and meetings of which he would try to create a think tank. But the ideas around the think tank and within the think tank is that every person's opinions would be respected, try to build consensus around ideas so we could kind of move forward in commonality. I also want to point out that, Dr. Bunseku was also someone that had researched that the language that was spoken in ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt was an offshoot of Kikongo. And so there's even more work being done now about, the African peoples that travel from particularly Central Africa to the Nile Valley, and what kind of languages is being spoken, in that region. So I think that's a great point to note because of the work that you are already doing and the work that you just mentioned that will be done around anything, I guess I can say anything Ubuntu.
Yes.
Now, and I think, in fact, that's great. Anything Ubuntu, as you mentioned, probably can bring us all together if we can make sure that everybody knows that is a wide expanse term and concept that unites us.
Yes.
That in fact it might bring us together in terms of philosophy, but at the same time it does bring in what I would call the geolinguistic at the same time, but working with philosophy and then start pulling people in to the geolinguistic parameters that kind of shape where we are now.
And just
Right,
to
brother.
point out before Allimadi moves on to his next question, just to point out that the use of the word Mbongi for our community is inspired by Fukiel. Yes, 100% inspired by him. Yes.
All right, so brother, one thing you spoke about in the chapter that I'd like us to also focus on is, the issue of dual citizenship. And you just don't put it randomly. You put it as an important aspect that could promote more economic cooperation between diaspora Africans and the continent. And that to me is something which is very important. I agree with. That should have been one of the mandates when the Organization of African Unity was first founded. And it certainly should have been the mandate when the African Union was founded. In fact, I feel so strongly about it. I think we should start to find ways to put pressure and to, in fact, shame African countries that are not yet moving toward making that an automatic part of the Constitution. Diaspora Africans, descendants of people that were forcefully hijacked and kidnapped from the continent should not beg to be automatically reinstated their citizenship. So now, in terms of some of the practical things, and because sadly, we talk about racism toward African people and African descendants. And a lot of it also comes from the false belief that poverty is automatically associated with Africa and
or
African
being
descendants.
African.
Or being African, right. Because the history is removed. So the knowledge, sadly, even for many African people, they don't know how they end up in the condition of impoverishment. They don't even see that there has to be some specific reasons, that wherever you find Africans or African descendants, generally they're in subordinated and impoverished conditions.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend, the late Les Payne, who is, by the way, the author of this brilliant book on Malcolm that came out about a year or two ago. He used to be an editor at Newsday. And he said, Milton, when he was growing up, he was about maybe 20 years older than me. So when he was growing up, there used to be a saying in this country: you don't stand a Chinaman's chance of doing it, because the Chinese had the reputation of not being able to do anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Back in the day. And of course, there was another European, racist stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I say that because both Les and I agreed when he said that, was that things change. Like in the 60s, don't eat your food. Americans would tell their children, European Americans, think of starving people in Africa, right? Or think of starving people in in India. They don't say that for India anymore. They don't say that certainly for China anymore. So that is why I think it's good that you included the need for the continent to embrace the skills and resources that diaspora has, and start using resources in Africa to uplift the lives, the standard of living of African people, rather than what it is today, selling raw materials dirt cheap, and then buying the products that are used with that raw material for prices that are multiplied exponentially 10 or hundreds of times, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can start that by focusing even on things that are doable, right? Even if you don't have the resources to build the mega factories, start producing automobiles, and all that stuff, there's things we can start that will start uplifting standard of living. For example, why can't we have our own manufactured, and I don't even know why they call it manufactured coffee, tea, cocoa, right?
Process, right?
They process it. They add nothing to it, and yet they put it in nice fancy packages, and then the prices are like 100 times more than what the farmer is getting in Ghana or in Cote d'Ivoire. This is where we can align capital that is controlled by Africans in diaspora with producers in African countries.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start by taking that sort of low-hanging fruit and corner that market for coffee, for cocoa, for tea. And then once we do it there, we can start having our own chains here. Why should we have a Starbucks? And not maybe Ubuntu coffee or what have you.
Hey, okay.
That's the kind of thing so I want you to talk a little bit about that as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I guess that's the economic insert or jump start that we can get into. So let me say this. Okay, so everyone knows about the African Free Trade Agreement, acronym as AFTA. So we know that only about 15% of the internal circulatory economic trade within the continent is between African countries.
It's crazy.
Where all other continents have at least 70% circulatory trade.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, and a lot of it we know has to do with colonial borders.
Yes.
But not just colonial borders, but it's the ideas behind the colonial borders that we were made strangers to each other, even countries that are now adjacent, strangers to one another, not just by, languages, but by walls being next to one another. So that is Togo really French Ghana, or is Ghana really English Togo? But you got the same people that are on both sides, but see themselves differently, not just by French, but by structure of economic structure, other kinds of things. And then we connect that to diaspora Africans who are in spaces outside of the physical African continent, who are African, but need to be brought into the economic mix of the continent getting itself together in terms of circulatory economics. So one of the things I want to say about that is, and this is something that we have, we're beginning to address at LKif, the Lutombi Kawana Integrity Foundation, the think tank that I told you that I'm a board member of, is something called an OCA card. It stands for Overseas Citizen of Africa card. Now that's a spin-off of something called an OCI card, which exists, Overseas Citizens of India card. So let me just delve into that for a second.
Right.
So we know India does not exactly give dual citizenship to its own diasporas, plural, that were either taken to East Africa or Southern Africa in the 19th century,
right,
or who had gone to islands like Jamaica or Trinidad as a workforce after Britain, stopped the slavery on the islands, and they just brought in Indian workers,
right,
or Indians who migrated from Uganda in the early 1970s to Britain, or Indians who went to different European countries, including the United States, voluntarily in the 1970s and beyond. But what the Indian government has realized is that their Indian diasporas, through whatever time periods they went to other places and still reside there, are a massive resource for the country of India, both in terms of business exchange, technology exchange, investment. They don't look at the Indian diasporas as being necessarily people who want to or need to necessarily migrate back to India just to live there, but are in fact are a very powerful external resource.
right.
So about 10 years ago, the government of India issued the ability for all people of Indian descent who live anywhere in the world outside of India to have an OCI card, where they basically can have all range of connections to India, maybe with the exception of voting, but everything else allows that synergy. So we know that Silicon Valley, for example, is heavily connected to people of Indian descent. So India benefits from that type of technology, interconnection, etc. So I think that an OCA card would be good for all Africans in the diaspora, regardless of whatever time period they have been in the diaspora, or whether they left voluntarily and maybe an immigrant to different places, whether it be United States, Canada, Australia, the EU. The reason why I'm bringing it up like this is because, for practical purposes, in the collective, these people are a resource for the continent.
Right.
Not all countries on the continent give dual citizenship at all.
Yeah.
So that means that people who are immediately from a particular country, it could be like Botswana, for example, that doesn't give dual citizenship, may find themselves in the UK, or may find themselves in Canada, and they don't necessarily get dual citizenship back in Botswana. Okay, so it need not be, okay, I give up citizenship in some external place to a particular country in Africa, but let's use all of these spaces and places as a resource. Why not?
I agree with you.
Because Zungu has used us as a resource, both human, intellectual, and material, in all kinds of ways.
And
so why don't we use our positioning wherever we are in the world to reconnect, to create synergies, to create interfaces, and to create targets of economic exchange wherever we are. So
Absolutely.
such a card, just in the beginning, would allow, you know, all African people to be able to you know, work within the AFTA regions, and to have that type of synergy. But we can eventually improve it as, you know, as time goes on, where people just, you know, choose whatever country they want as an automatic citizen, and maybe it would encourage all of the African countries that currently do not give dual citizenship to their immediate diaspora to do that, as well as to expand those citizenships to Africans of the diaspora that might have been from longer ago eras, particularly when it came to the slave trade. And I did just wanted to point out something, Milton, you said more at the onset of our discussion today. You mentioned about, you know, the diaspora coming from the western end, mostly, of the continent. And I think that we have to also define what West is. And I'm going to tie this in to maybe some sentiments that I was expressing to Nduku right before the program backstage, when I mentioned something about Angola. Tie this in. So we take a place like Angola. Today, Angola is a part of SADC, Southern African Development Community. Okay, but 300 years ago, then what we now know as Angola was part of the Congo Kingdom with a K, that was considered Central Africa. But before that, from a maritime perspective, European ships that looked at the coast didn't deal with internal geographies like central and east and all like that. They just looked at the coastline, and they identified the entire coastline on that area as being a Guinea coast. So somewhere like where Senegambia is the upper Guinea coast, and where Angola is the lower Guinea coast. So a place like that is you know, has been in all kinds of different geographies. So if that be the case, then if these places are in different kinds of geographies, then we need to look at where we are and who we are before colonialism. Now, if we were to look at the diaspora overall in the Western Hemisphere, I'm going to call this I'm going to say that we took the tri-node region of Senegambia, drew a dot from that all the way into DRC, and then drew a dot from DRC all the way to Angola, put a huge triangle, a huge circle around all those countries that are in that region, plus Mozambique, which Portuguese people used to call that Portuguese East Africa. So plus Madagascar. Then that is the collective regions where diaspora in the Western Hemisphere, including the United States, have come from. Just to show you, what we now know as New York and New Jersey was formerly a Dutch colony. And that's where we get these names, these Dutch names like Amsterdam, Holland, Harlem. And so many Africans were taken from in the 17th century, were taken from what's now Madagascar, taken around the bottom of the continent where the Boers were in 1600s, and then shipped off to colonies of Holland, what was parts of Suriname, and also into colonies in New York, New Jersey.
Yeah.
And I just point those things out because we need to know what is where, you know, and who we are, and all these kinds of discussions help us to understand that even if we are separated now by oceans and languages and sometimes identifications, if we can work on a way, as Nduku, you have said, the Ubuntu-ness, if I can say, of things, then we begin to get at the core of similarities and commonalities that sort of create the undergirding efforts for wanting to connect up economically. So it doesn't matter where we are on the planet, that we know that we're African people. We know that Africa, the physical continent, is really the source of material and energy that the entire world lives on.
Right.
But if the entire world lives on Africa, we as African people must also control our resources and must see it as a resource for ourselves.
Yes.
Absolutely. And part of what you're saying is, as things evolve in Africa and we get to a borderless Africa, a lot of that also issue will be diminished, you know.
The other thing too, economically, before I ask the next question, is it must be a relationship that is not based on exploitation. And capitalism, as we know it today, is exploitative. So one of the things actively at Mbongia Ubuntu is we're saying any business that we engage in, we're not going to take more than 30% profit margin. This ensures that we're not exploiting whoever we're doing business with, right? If we're going to be working with authors, we're not taking rights to their book, like to ownership to what they have written. We're not taking that as a publishing company. That remains to them. Like that is, they have written, as much as we know knowledge does not belong to any one person. We cannot have an author who spent the time doing a research, putting up information and all that, have to sell. And in many times it's not an equitable exchange, right? Sell the right to their book, and the book continues to sell and sell and sell, and this person does not have the right to say, you know what, I want to pull my book out and put it in another situation. So that's these things we have to actively start practicing. And the one thing I'm saying is the diaspora, which I'm seeing currently, right? You have people moving from here thinking they're Africans who are going to Africa to help, and they're exploiting. They're getting into the same practice of exploiting. They're talking about, let's get the minerals, they're exploiting. I have a gentleman based in DC, and he's involved in the secondhand clothing business. African gentleman born and raised here, of enslaved Africans. And that is a business that is very exploitative to Africans, the secondhand clothing business. It makes loads and loads of money and continues to exploit Africans because, number one, it's destroying the chance of any manufacturing of fabric being done on the continent, and therefore the opportunity for us to develop our economy. So
Ubuntu economics is an area that some people would get into. I remember one time in the live chat, of course, you were talking about economics in that particular case, but I think I wrote in something about, when we talk about Ubuntu, it's multi-layered. We can talk about, governance. We can talk about economic. We can talk about our way of life, our philosophy to ourselves and to other people. So perhaps Ubuntu in the larger context can be used to talk about economics and what is beneficial economically without being exploitative. So we don't have to get into capitalism and socialism by name. We can just define the narratives and the broadness of our own economic understanding from the ways that you've mentioned. So, for example, you can, re-energize me on what you were talking about the 30%.
Yeah, you cannot make more than 30% profit margin.
Okay, so that might be for us an Ubuntu concept. that what we want to do is to allow a profit margin, but without it being exploitative.
Exactly.
And then we go back to that is Ubuntu for us in terms of the idea that I am because we care about our community, we care about the individual in context to the group. All of it should have synergy. The group should benefit, the individual can benefit, and therefore we have an economic synergy. So when we begin to think like that, we can sort of map our way forward on all areas. But it comes back to the Ubuntu-ness, say it that way, as a core, because once we start with who the people are, then we have to branch out to what is their worldview. That means what are their ideas about politics, what are their ideas about social development, what are their ideas about economics.
As we talk about Ubuntu and how it is all inclusive, right? And we need to bring, as I think now, Allimadi, we should bring Dr. Kanyisile. We'll bring her on when she does release her book so that she can talk about that as she talks about African spirituality. But let's talk about political cooperation, how we engage with each other politically to empower each other. I see, for me, the way the peoples of Ubuntu, and I'll use African now as people because it's a term that people are used to. In the diaspora, the way they can help is by holding those governments that they exist in accountable as far as their behavior, their actions, their activities they're taking in African lands, what they're doing. So you hold them accountable. How Africa is going to engage in that cooperation politically is Africa should start holding these nations where their people are in, for example, the United States, accountable. For example, Africa today should say, if you, United States, I know Ruto is about to travel to Washington. Part of the conversation should be, before Ruto signs anything, you've had this many number of shootings of African people in the last 2 months. We need this to stop. And as long as this number is showing up, we cannot do business with you. You cannot continue to treat our people in this way and expect to do trade with us. So in order for you to get access to the resources in Africa, this is how we expect you to treat our people. That's the way Africa can reciprocate in that relationship. But speak about that.
No, actually, let me interject also a question before you respond. This won't happen under a president like Ruto. And it won't happen, unfortunately, with most of the African presidents that we have right now. I like reading many clips going back to see how Western publications covered engagement with Africa, going back to like after they started decolonizing. So there was a front page story, which was remarkable if you compare to today's terms. It was at that time the Prime Minister of Uganda, later became president when Uganda became a republic, Prime Minister Milton Obote. And the headline was, Ugandan Premier condemns mistreatment of Black people in the South. So it was happening in the 20th century, but you know what imperialism did, of course. They mark you and target you for elimination or removal from office.
Which they did to Milton,
Which they did to him, which they did to Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah, of course, also spoke about the mistreatment of sisters and brothers in this country. Nkrumah came to Harlem, but he was invited by Adam Clayton Powell. And there's a photo of him sitting there, Nkrumah dressing with Malcolm also sitting close to Adam Clayton Powell. So these things actually used to happen. But now if you look today, then people get the impression that, all these African leaders don't care about what's happening to diaspora. They actually care, but unfortunately, they have no power. They have no power for when a U.S. president says, well, you know what? Because of what you said, you're not going to get that World Bank loan. You're not going to get that IMF loan. So we need to deal with that aspect as well. Otherwise, they're not going to become forthcoming.
The dependency
to go back to where they were in the 1960s. Imagine, in the 1960s, they were actually doing that. And it was making a difference. It made the front page of the New York Times.
But it also goes back to how centered the individuals are in the Ubuntu way, right? How centered they are in ensuring that how they treat others is bringing positivity. Fellow Africans is bringing positivity. That's the difference between those leaders and these ones. And we can say, yes,
Absolutely.
maybe they behave the way they do because of fear, but a person like Ruto behaves the way he does because he's self-centered, because he wants to uplift himself and not the community. So there's that aspect of it too. And again, like all things African, it's a very expansive conversation that cannot be limited to one way of addressing it. But yes, Brother Baruti, if you can speak about the political cooperation, please.
Well, I do believe that the strength of the continent improves the position and leverage of African people in the diaspora, particularly in this case in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make two mentions of a couple of things in kind of a parallel to that. So people who were victims of the Japanese internment camps in the United States in World War II, and maybe some of their direct descendants as well, got some forms of economic recompense, let me put it that way, in the Reagan administration in the 1980s. But a lot of that had to do with the U.S. wanting to have trade deals with Japan, and Japan made, so it's been researched, Japan made some stipulations that recompense needed to be made to those internment camp victims and their descendants in some way before Japan would engage in certain trade deals with the U.S.
Right.
Was leverage that the Japanese people in the United States had on the U.S. government because of their connection to Japan. The next thing I want to point out is about 2 years ago, the Biden administration put in place the anti-Asian hate bill.
Yes.
And that, in large part, was a derivative of some pushback and some negative, hostile feelings toward Asian people based upon COVID.
Which they created themselves, the government. But go on.
Right. And so, because, particularly in this case, South Korea, having certain trade deals with the U.S., it was mentioned that there needs to be something to be done to protect Asian people from the threat of racism or hostility that could, be very negatively impactful upon their population. So that means that all peoples need to be connected if they are in an environment where they are a minority of people amongst others, need to actually have leverage with a external source that is able to give certain protections to them as they gain leverage within that space.
Correct.
So if we take the African diaspora in the United States, particularly those who would have been in the United States for long periods of time based upon forced migration from Africa based upon the transatlantic slave trade, and in part the Arab slave trade. I know that's another complete show in general, but trades in general because they intersected. Then these people would have been completely cut off from a political linkage to a particular African country, which leaves this population, vulnerable to white supremacy domination or Mzungu supremacy domination without having a political link to African countries themselves. So, as a scenario, suppose that you had African peoples in the U.S., the bulk, were engaging with the continent through an OCA card, direct dual citizenship at a critical mass, then that means that, for example, let's say that there was an anti-African hate bill in the United States. And it could be that these people were citizens of Uganda, or the citizens of Zambia, or citizens of Nigeria, or not. And it came down to, well, okay, the U.S. wants to have engagements with these different countries, and these various countries would say, well, why is it that you need an anti-African hate bill? You mean that that you really just hate Africans? No, it's not so much that. Oh, we're trying to work through racial problems, black people in the United States. Oh, no. You see, these people are African people who are citizens of Nigeria or Kenya or Angola or Zambia or Uganda. And so the mere fact you have to have such a bill is saying that you really have lots of people who hate African people, whether it be Nigerian or Ugandan or whatnot. See, that gives greater power about the discussion.
Yeah.
Right.
So that means that if you want to deal with these various countries, then you're going to have to treat all of their representatives correctly in the spaces in which they live. Okay, so if these countries, though, are not independent of the so-called Mzungu nations, then they're not also, on the other end of things, in a position to throw around their weight about what they won't do in regard to trade with these countries. That's why, to me, the AFTA agreements, AFTA as a mechanism for creating the circulatory economic jumpstart within the continent, and the engagement of diaspora and others into that economic mix will have to be done. So let me throw a question at you, Milton.
Yes, sir.
Then, if that be the case, and if you agree with that, let me see if you do or not. If you agree with that, then tell me how you think that the AFTA agreement can be jump-started so that African countries won't have to depend upon aid or trade or bullying from EU countries or the US.
When you say AFTA, you're referring to the Africa Free Trade Agreement.
Trade agreement, yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So the African Free Trade, International Free Trade, Continental African Free Trade Agreement is absolutely a brilliant concept, and it's nothing new. Of course, they're embracing what Kwame Nkrumah had called for in neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. They're finally putting some of his ideas into paper and implementation. And even then, which has always been the challenge to African unity, is surrendering sovereignty, And, you're going to have to surrender some sovereignty. And that's always been the challenge, right? All of them want to be president of their little pond, right? And that's going to be a challenge even going forward. I like what the example of the West Africa, the Mali, Burkina Faso, and the country that is currently referred to as Niger, but you told us the correct pronunciation. But I'll leave that. I'll still refer it as Niger for the purpose of today's conversation.
And don't forget about Nigeria.
Change their
Right. But these countries, when they imposed the French sanctions on them using ECOWAS as the barking pit bull for France, you see what they did. They came together and they said an attack on any one of us is going to be seen as an attack on all three of us. Yeah. And then they signing documents for joint military resistance. and they signed papers for political integration. Now, whether they move forward with that in practice or not is a different issue. But I think the stand that they took is what caused ECOWAS to back off from that attack. So we need principal leaders in African countries who are willing to surrender some sovereignty in order to implement the Continental African Free Trade Agreement. But that ultimately is what will really elevate Africa, because they address a lot of the issues that we've been discussing. Intra-African trade, which is abysmal. How can you have 15% intra-African trade when your trade with European countries comes to like 70 or 80%, as you said? So yes, there's some beginning of the elements that needs to be put in place, but still some of the drivers at the steering wheel are not suitable to deliver on this. And we need to put pressure on them and encourage the citizens in those countries to put the correct drivers in place.
So since you mentioned
ECOWAS,
the ECOWAS, just by its construction, should be an economic bloc that would have, in some ways, surrendered some sovereignty, because these different countries that make up ECOWAS, I think it's about 14 countries maybe, that would come together underneath this union, haven't really relinquished the type of sovereignty that is translated into certain strength. What is wrong in your view with the EAC and SADC? Wouldn't all these economic blocs represent a certain relinquishment of sovereignty? Right. And if they have and are supposed to be economic blocs, why don't they now, in addition to ECOWAS, have greater power?
All right. So I like that question because Cheikh Anta Diop answered them in Black Africa,
he did,
the economic and cultural basis for a federated state. And he spoke about actually the ECOWAS also and these other organizations. He said they're putting the cart in front of their horse. He said their achievements are going to be limited because the first thing they need to do is surrender sovereignty. Once you surrender sovereignty and you have presidential executive councils that can implement executive decisions, then you can implement the economic structures and decisions that need to be made. But now you're listing all the things that need to be done, but you don't have the executive authority to execute those plans. And he answers exactly the question that you're posing right now in this book. And I agree with him, absolutely.
Yeah, you know? I was going to add too, as you both talk about after the Africa Trade Free Agreement, that is not an African agreement. That's an agreement that the white man told Africans to sign under their conditions, because we know today under the free trade agreement, the Africa Free Trade, the Africa Free, these white people, they are the most genius human beings that have been put on this planet. Let me just say that right now, not in the terms of intelligence or anything, but in the time of the terms of criminality. Having ninja tactics of doing criminality in the name of helping, right? This is something the United States has been doing from back when, even when they were going to Cuba to assist and pretending that they're helping the Cubans. Well, we know very well why they were trying to go in there. So the Africa Trade Agreement, number one, is not so African. It isn't. And there's nothing free about it when it comes to the African. There's everything free about it when it comes to the bosses who told them to have that agreement. So what that does, it makes sure all these companies from imperialist nations do not pay taxes in Africa, and they can operate in Africa. They don't pay not 1 cent of taxes, but they can operate in Africa freely. So that is helping them. If we are going to continue as Africans who are looking at us and our well-being, we must rid ourselves of these agreements that we came into with Wazungus at the table. We must create our own agreements. It has to be, and it's not just, it's an African intercontinental trade agreement or economic development agreement without any white people, whether they are good or bad, without them at the table telling us what we need to do. It has to be something done by us. So I'm for getting rid of all of them and starting over.
Okay, I read the agreement and there are many good parts to it. It's just the question of can we, because if we have the executive decision, we can bar many of these multinational companies from coming from African countries and put preference over African companies. So
But
at the
that's
end of the day, it's going to end up being who are the drivers. If we have the characters of the three leaders in
thank you.
Mali, Burkina, and Niger, and of course, all of them are evoking the memory of Sankara. If we had 50 Sankaras in Africa, I think within 15 to 20 years, even in our lifetime, we will see dramatic changes in terms of uplifting.
Even
Because
just
all it takes is
10 Sankara.
stopping selling our commodities at dirt-free prices. That's the most basic thing we have to start with. And then using it domestically. If we can do that for 15, 20 years in a row, right now, most African countries give foreign aid to Europe, to Asia, to the United States in terms of the resources, because that's what it is. If you're taking it for cheap, it means they're subsidizing your lifestyle in the industrialized country.
Agreed, brother. Thank you so much for joining us. I want the conversation to continue because you have brought up issues that I am currently very, very interested in, and
we'll have him back, definitely.
Right, hoping that we
Sure.
can all sit and discuss them further and implement action items. It always has to go beyond the conversation, right, into action. What are your last words, Baruti?
Well, just a
And
couple of
contact
thoughts.
information.
One is, Nduku, you mentioned the term Mbongi Ubuntu as an organization that you are a part of. Are you translating Mbongi in that sense as a think tank or as like a political architecture? Just tell me what Mbongi meant in that sense.
We are taking it for its African meaning. The whole thing, the political, it's the cyclical meaning of Mbongi, not just political, just like Ubuntu, right? Not just political, not just being nice. Ubuntu, here's the thing. People hear Ubuntu and they think it's about kumbaya. Let's all be nice and take care of each other and be nice. No, Ubuntu has warriors. Ubuntu has taking out your enemy as
Right.
Ubuntu. So we're taking Mbongi in its full sense. And when we have our website app, we'll have a description of all these words based on how we understand them. So yes.
Yeah, that's something that probably needs to be talked about at a later time. That some people think that Ubuntu is not strong enough to heal ourselves.
Oh no, Ubuntu has warriors.
To come up with a way forward. They think that Ubuntu just means be nice to other people, like turn the other cheek, even if you are despitefully used or so. And that's not really true. It's talking about the healing of ourselves and gaining strength through our own healing, our own interaction, and our own ability to create a space in which we talk amongst ourselves to build our own assessment and use of our own resources.
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to point out is that country of Zambia, or in Zambia, this past December 26th, the first Kwanzaa celebration was celebrated in Zambia by a coalition of groups and personnel, inclusive of LKif, that was part of that. And a documentary is being finished now, and it should be out by April.
Nice.
So if we look at Kwanzaa and its expansion, not just in the United States, but it has been celebrated in South Africa, Republic of South Africa, for about at least 12 years now. There's a jumpstart celebration. It was in Zambia and I think Ghana and some other places. We can expand that. That's great. I want to say that because I am with LKif, perhaps in the future, ongoingly, maybe we can find ways of continued interconnectedness.
Oh yes.
Kumbukeni. I think we would have a lot that we could share together. I think that these mediums, in terms of technology, that we're using these resources to connect up as African people wherever we are. And I would say shaking hands across borders and oceans.
Yes.
And so if I have to give a parting
word,
step, I think that hopefully spells out what we're trying to do in the spirit of Ubuntu, in the large context of Bantu, and in the embrace and much larger super core connectedness of Ubuntu-ness, if I can sort of piggyback Nduku of what you've said. But I have certainly enjoyed being with you, both of you today. Thank you very much for giving me a chance to engage with you. And I think it's been a great exchange. I have learned a lot. And hope that the listening audience has benefited as well.
Yeah.
Karibu sana.
I will say, as you talk about Kwanzaa and expanding it, that we at Mbongi ya Ubuntu will be putting out our first Kiswahili book on Kwanzaa. It's going to be all in Kiswahili. As a way to help our brothers and sisters who do not speak the language yet, we will have an English version translated eventually, but we're putting out the first Kiswahili book. Why? Because we want this practice known on the continent by the people on the continent, our brothers and sisters on the continent. But I will say, as we continue to speak about Ubuntu, Utu, Ntu, Kibuntu, the Kwanzaa principles, as they are essentially part of that too, which is why we are embracing them and saying if we celebrate, and our proposal if we celebrate it is not necessarily to celebrate it with Christmas, because that is not aligned with our African calendars, right? But to celebrate it based on our calendars, because if Kwanzaa means a celebration of the first fruit, then it should be celebrated at the time when we have the first fruit in Africa. But those are just my thoughts. Allimadi. Sorry.
So Dr. Karanga did say that the founder of Kwanzaa did use a phrase in one of his books on Kwanzaa, that the positioning of Kwanzaa came at a time when the edges of the earth meet. And that was from, an Ashanti saying. So he did look at various first fruit festivals and when they were held and try to pick a convenient time in which we can make an adaptation of those, centered in the nestled area between time frame December 26th to January 1st. But that is a good observation, Nduku, that you made.
And before Allimadi gives his closing words, if you can please share how the community can reach you. We shared a couple of Baruti's books, if you all can support in that way, but how can they reach you if they need to connect with you?
Okay, so let me give my email, UFUNDI320@yahoo.com. And for everybody, ufundi, that's actually the Swahili word for technology or crafts.
Yes.
Or craftsmanship, yes. To reach Baruti, please, email. Allimadi, your closing words.
Yes, brother, thank you for the knowledge that you dropped today. We look forward to hosting you again in the future. And I just like how we keep connecting our African history, African culture, integrate that with the economic possibilities. But at the end of the day, we have to see ourselves as an African collective.
Yes.
So everybody, asanteni sana, karibu.
Asanteni, kwaherini.
Yes. Tutawanana kwasasa, and thank you again for having me.
Brother, please remain. We can chat when we close out, but please remain.
Sure.